go first? Yeah, well, fully.
Do you want to loan this for the presentation?
I think I might steal all of your items. I don't really have any use for the ostrich picture, but I might be able to use the other ones.
Is it recording? Yes. Okay.
How's my hair looking? Is it okay?
It's beautiful.
Looking gorgeous, don't worry.
Yeah, Deaglan and I similarly sat down at the start of the session, and we both had previously thought of situations that we're going to encounter over the next couple of weeks, and we both also had an idea of a solution to each of our problems, which we sort of come up with ourselves. So we just kind of reinforced each other's solution and agreed that it was a good way of illustrating a concept. I think they're both concepts, but completely different sort of context. And I'm faced with a similar situation in a couple of weeks where I'm trying to apply mechanical principles to biological tissues, but with a group of third-year students who have specifically chosen not to choose biomechanics in the third year, and I've opted for a more practical pathway because they dislike biomechanics. So I was thinking about this session that I'm teaching in a couple of weeks, and how I can again sort of illustrate the concepts of mechanical strain, stress, forces, stiffness, all these sort of weird and wonderful phrases that we use to describe the mechanics of biological tissues in a way which the students can relate to and apply to the human body. Because a lot of the models that you see in textbooks are all these weird and wonderful sort of spring models that don't really mean anything. You struggle to apply it to real life sort of human locomotion, and also for me, I'm looking at the tendon in particular, and again in textbooks, obviously because they're just two-dimensional images of these structures, you again struggle to sort of apply it to a three-dimensional structure and articulate across different joints and all these other things. So I was actually trying to find, do you remember Stretch Armstrong and Stretch Scooby-Doo? That kind of material and the sort of stress relievers you can buy for silly Christmas gifts for your friends and family and things like that. Sorry if anybody's bought those for their families or friends for Christmas, referring to it as silly. But we couldn't find one anyway, could we?
No, we tried.
They appear to have been replaced by these sort of water-filled balloons that sort of stretch but don't necessarily have the properties I was looking for. And the reason I was looking for that type of material in particular is because it's viscoelastic, because the tendon has both elastic properties and viscous properties. So if a system was purely elastic, like an elastic band, you'd stretch it, energy would be stored in that elastic band, and when you let go, it would recoil back to its original shape. And in the process of doing so, in terms of the tendon, that will provide extra energy for the muscle, which increases the efficiency of the muscle. It doesn't have to use its own energy by metabolising various things in order to create that energy. But because it's viscous, there's like a time-dependent limitation to the rate of this material deforming back to its original shape. So I was trying to find something like one of those Stretch Armstrong clothes, which are £22, so we're completely over the budget that we're allowed with £3. So I was just after a basic sort of material that you could sort of stretch, it'd hold its stretched length for a period of time before returning back to its original shape. And for me, I thought that would be a useful tool for me to explain strain, which is the fractional elongation of a material. Stress, mechanical stress, which is the ability of the material to resist that strain. So I could use that also to add, I could add weights to it. I've sort of thought about, do you know the little 1 gram and 2 gram weights you can get? You can add that to this material, suspend it or something in the class, add weights to it, and watch it sort of change its length as you add additional weights to it. And obviously when that weight reaches a certain point, it's just going to keep on straining, go beyond its elastic range into a sort of almost plastic region. And if you stretch it too much, like you can do with the tendon, and the forces are too great, it might not return back to its original shape, which is where Francis will come in and sort of try and rehabilitate them appropriately. I ended up buying this spring because I should have probably said, if those who don't know, you have a muscle, and then ensues in the muscle you have a tendon. And when a muscle contracts to produce force, the force has to be transferred from the muscle through the tendon to the bone in order for movement at that joint to occur. So the tendon plays a massive role in regulating the output of the muscle. So if a tendon's too compliant, so it's too stretchy, when the muscle contracts, it has to take up that original lapse sort of length before the force will be effectively transmitted from the muscle through to the bone. So, for example, in this spring, if you have it's a spring that doesn't open, then I thought it was stuck. If you have a really sort of compliant tendon, if the muscle's contracting, it's going to have to take up that slack before the actual system will shorten. It's illustrated better with something like this sort of material, which will return to its original shape. Obviously this needs a bit of gentle sort of persuasion, but then you can also apply the spring system to the leg. So when if this is a leg, as you walk and you bend or flex your ankle, knee and hip, your leg will shorten, and then when you extend and push off to propel yourself forward, it will return back to its original length. And some of the, if the time period's quick enough between that lengthening and shortening, you'll have some energy stored in the system which will facilitate that sort of returning back to its original shape. So I was trying to come up with ideally a stretch Armstrong type toy that doesn't cost £22.
eBay.
Do you know what I mean? Because the other thing as well, people think of these things in a very linear sort of way, whereas the tendon, can I use this?
Yeah.
It's three-dimensional, especially the patella tendon as it sort of attaches across the knee. You've got sort of different types of strain being applied to it. You've got tension, compression and shear forces, where you have two equal and opposite forces acting against each other, and it ends up moving in a sort of three-dimensional manner rather than just a sort of linear fashion. So anyway, that was my plan. So I need to try and either steal that or find something that's going to do an equally effective job.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
What are you chewing?
I know, we mentioned that about sweets. We went to the sweet shop to see.
And actually, if you make it malleable enough, then it will return into a flatter shape, won't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and you can talk about temperature effects and all those sort of things as well.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. I know it's just anything that just will stretch and return back to its original shape. Unless you stretch it too much.
Sweets always work really well in class, I've noticed.
I just make sure the students chew their own chewing gum and take it out around Neil said you've got to play with this. Yeah. By the way, did you know 3 ostriches in a meter's walk and
play my chewing gum, you're going to fail.
Not everyone, feet under your desks.
Right, I'm pausing it.
Okay. Well, my problem was that I have to teach a play entitled De Montfort, and it was written in 1798 and published in 1798. And it's a play that's it was a product of the Romantic period in literature, and the Romantic period is, although it's technically within the modern period, it's still it's difficult to teach because. The literature is, I think it's written in an entirely different register than that than anything that students are used to now. Students are more used to literature and I suppose other kind of cultural expressions or products that tell them things immediately. But romantic literature is a much more drawn out process, and it takes some time for an idea to be expressed. It's simply because that's how people experienced emotions in this period as well. And this play, De Montfort, was part of a series of plays entitled Plays on the Passions. And I try to get students to work out, or to understand at least, that the passions were experienced in a very different register than they are now. But at the same time, there are kind of correspondences. So this is what I spoke to John about, and I actually, before we went off in the exercise, I actually tested this theory. I wanted to ask him, and you seemed to think that it made sense. The thing that struck me was, and again back to your presentation, what's important is culture, context, and meaning, and I think that's really, really important. So one of the things about Romanticism is that it's of a different period, so the context is different, and I wanted to get this idea across to students. And the play is about a man, De Montfort, who's eaten up by hatred. He hates his friend. He's fallen out with a friend, but is consumed by hatred, and it ultimately destroys him. Now, not many of my students will go through that process, I'm sure, and dearly hope. And but I was trying to think of an example, a recent example that might register with them. And one thing that struck me was that actually where we're at is an ideal example of when a passion, an emotion, or a belief might actually become destructive. And I needed John's help with this because John had local knowledge about this particular part of Manchester. I knew in 1996 there was a very destructive explosion here, and I think it actually occurred just
Next to the post box.
right just by the post box out here.
Yeah.
Right, and if you look around, you know, you wouldn't necessarily think that something like that happened, a moment of fierce destruction, and so our present context, our present day context, our moment is much different to all of that. It looks very prosperous. The place has been regenerated, and
The sun's shining. The sun's shining.
and the sun's shining too. So.
Take a photograph quickly.
Yeah.
So this is what I was trying to get across to the students. First of all, that I teach with a kind of historical thrust, and the idea is that in the 1790s there were a lot of events like that. There were political explosions, the French Revolution and so on, and this then influences literature, but in a way that they might not be used to. But I wanted them to think about a similar event such as the explosion in Manchester, which then defined a moment in the city and actually defined the modernisation of the city. And then So I was hoping that this might work, because without getting into the politics of what led to the explosion, it was about a heightened kind of political emotion. That's what led to this moment of destruction. Like the character de Montfort, who's kind of explodes within, you know, or implodes, let's say. And another thing that struck me then was that at the same time, we often respond to crises, say, like for example, like the recent riots in the city and in other cities, by trying to counter it with counter emotions. And this is where my thing came in. It's gone actually beyond language to iconography. We've seen them all over the city. I think they appeared around just in response to the riots. And I love Manchester, but I heart Manchester. So maybe this would be a way to tell the students, well, we still think about things in an emotional register, even though we're not as consciously plugged into the emotions or wired into them in the way that people were in the 1790s when this play was written. But they're still important. It's just that we're kind of less used to reflecting upon them. The Romantics were a very reflective movement. So I thought that might work as well. But I suppose the bottom line of this then is that what we do, where we live, what we experience is often the result of types of emotion, whether this be love, hatred, or various passions or ambition and so on. And I know it's probably a bit abstract, but I was trying to get them to think about particular moments and contexts in which emotions are heightened, such as during the recent disturbances with the riots, and then they're countered with this, or indeed back in 1996 when that explosion happened.
Really good thing to take note, because I was just thinking the other thing that's now gone, but where we met originally, all on that wall were where people put post-it notes up right after the riot. They could come in and you could put a post-it note up saying about how you love Manchester, and a lot of people were driven to come in and either help with the clean-up or to put, and that whole wall was completely covered by people's expressions of annoyance or love for the city or whatever. And it was funny because my cousin was saying the other day that he's somebody who doesn't do anything for the community, but he felt driven to come into Manchester to clean up, because he said he was so angry that people had the audacity to come in and just nick stuff for the sake of it, and he wanted to cut, and he said, and I wouldn't bother doing anything else. But so that's a good analogy to use, isn't it? Actually, that
He cared more about his city than...
he was annoyed that people felt that they should do that, so he wanted to come and help clean up the city. So it's an emotional response to that.
Do you know, I think one emotional response that you might find easy to get into their brains, especially one that's heightened emotion and not entirely rational always either, from my point of view, is football. And if you think about Manchester, you've got your two opposing teams, so you've got United supporters for anyone who isn't actually from Manchester, and then you've got your Manchester City for... There you go. And they might identify really well with that. Because what you don't want to do is kind of sex it up. You don't want to dumb it down, but they'll probably identify much better with the riots and football.
Yeah, football maybe a bit.
It's good that you can bring upon the positive effects as well. Because actually all of this, none of this would exist without the bomb.
Exactly. Yeah.
So to anybody who's lived in Manchester sort of before and after, they'll say it's one of the best things that ever happened. So that black and white pub in town
is the only the mitre,
that never used to be there. They physically dismantled it and shifted it down there to make space for this. But without the bomb, it would have never been a rationale for it. They've never been able to afford to. So all of this underneath this, the massive basement, it's all been built over what was there before, and it just built new on the top to try and cap it off and sort of reintegrate it into the city. So it's a tremendous catalyst. It's right by the postbox. The postbox is the only thing that's standing because it was right next to the postbox and it's just cast iron. It's going nowhere. You need Hiroshima to turn for tea to make that job. But it's a brilliant catalyst. So to see such a destructive force become a positive force is really quite a...
That's exactly the same as the recent riots.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, such a destructive force that actually has, you know, brought this whole, you know, emotional response. And also, I don't think it's true that they're not so emotional. I think that teenagers and students, I think they're more emotional. I think they're even more tuned in, and they're even better at expressing their emotions.
I think what I was saying is
the slow,
that kind of emotion. It's a different historical period.
Yeah.
You can't deny that history changes people. You know.
But I think that human emotion stays.
But the environment you live in influences the way you experience emotions as well. And that was a really horrific period. Historically, everybody was rioting everywhere, and people were affected and pretending that perhaps things weren't there as well. Some stage, you know, talking about love all the time with these high emotions, but then there were people dying on the street. So I think it's a good way of bringing it back to history, and I really like it.
Yeah, I like that.
Good. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Just to say that whole marriage of the modern and the historical was really good way. Yeah, I think really good. Yeah, good way to teach
your lecture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Self-conscious.